Let's return to our main story. And the health regulator has found there were a series of errors, omissions and misjudgments in the mental health care of a man who then went on to kill 3 people in Nottingham.
Valdo Calacane fatally stabbed Ian Coates, Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar last June. A report released today by the Care Quality Commission says immediate action is needed to ensure patients get the right care and has set out recommendations for the NHS Trust in Nottinghamshire.
Let's have a look at some of those ideas. It says that treatment plans for those with schizophrenia must be reviewed regularly to make sure they are in line with national guidelines.
The Trust should ensure clinical supervision when deciding whether to detain someone under the Mental Health Act.
It says the Trust should make sure staff are aware of the importance of involving patients' families and carers in all aspects of their treatment.
And the CQC says services must have a robust discharge policy that considers a patient's circumstances and whether discharging them is appropriate.
Well, the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, says he expects services across England to learn from this review so that other families don't have to experience what he called the unimaginable pain that Barnaby, Grace and Ian's families are living with.
We can now speak to Marjorie Wallace, who's the founder and chief executive of the mental health charity SANE. Morning to you. Thank you so much for talking to us this morning. This is such a distressing case, obviously, it goes without saying, and an incredibly difficult time for the families of the victims. But just looking at the details of what we've seen so far, how unusual is this situation? How unusual is the language that we're hearing in this report? Those words that we've heard there appear to have been a series of errors, omissions and misjudgments. It's fairly damning, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's one of the most damning reports that I've read, and I've been going to inquiries and reports for over 30 years. But sadly, although this is a very terrible, horrific headline case, sadly the same kinds of things are happening all the time, not always leading to headline tragedies. And you could pick out one or two of the things. The problem is that we have nowhere for people to go. One of the fundamental reasons is that we have actually halved the number of adult psychiatric beds since 2000. We've only got about 18,000 left in the country. And so when a person does pose a risk, the tendency is to say that they aren't sufficient risk and therefore they can go back and live in the community. Now, what worries us and concerns us in this case is that it seems to be that it was his rights, was Valdo Calacane's rights to refuse taking medication, the antipsychotic medication, which might have kept the voices in his head at bay, which might have not got him to a state of deterioration, and his right to choose not to engage with services. Well, that seems extraordinary that the very person who's most deserved is the one that chooses not to engage with the services rather than the services looking after him. Now, those are two very simple things that could have been avoided. And so, of course, he disengaged with services and he sort of disappeared into the community. And partly the idea that we have is that everybody, however ill or disturbed they may be, can be treated in the community, even though we know that the community services are absolutely threadbare.
So we just ran through, Marjorie, some of the recommendations from this report today. From what you're saying is, on their own, they're not enough.
Absolutely not. We've got the psychiatric... This report exposes that the psychiatric services are not only in crisis, they're in breakdown. And part of that is they simply don't have the staff. It's the one area in health with the least staff, where they can't retain staff. They don't have consultant psychiatrists, enough of those, community nurses, counsellors. They simply don't have the kind of infrastructure and the staff. And it's in this case, it's almost unbelievable. You know, he's admitted under the section of the Mental Health Act about 4 times. He goes on committing acts of violence, and even then, he's assessed to be not a sufficient risk to require inpatient treatment again. We had a caller the other day coming to our helpline saying that it's so difficult to access care and help. She said that I would have had to have actually committed suicide or taken my own life, or maybe been a risk to others, until they took me seriously enough that I would qualify for the very high threshold to have inpatient care. Otherwise, people have just turned back and, on a wing and a prayer, they've had to fend for themselves. They may get visits from the community teams, but the community teams are so overstretched, they can't spend the time with the person. And the person is then not followed up, as in Valdo's case. He wasn't actually followed up. But can I just make the point that we feel is something, it's not huge resources, it's listening to the families when they ring up or they contact and they have concerns about deteriorating mental health. And we did our own research and we analysed over 100 homicide cases. And in the inquiry reports, it was identified that one of the trigger cases leading to the tragedy was a failure. 52% said it was a failure to listen to the families. And it's still not mandatory to put down their concerns or to communicate their concerns into the care teams. So that leads to a failure of risk assessment. 75% of the cases we analysed, it was a failure of risk assessment. People were assessed to be a low risk because they can sometimes dissemble very well, as he did. You can say, I'm not hearing voices, in order, because he doesn't want to engage.
Marjorie,
So
I'm afraid I'm really...
families and patients.
Indeed.
If you just listened, it's not a huge revolution resource.
So many intersecting interests and so many questions. Marjorie Wallace, Chief Executive of the mental health charity SANE. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.